I will be presenting a paper we just submitted with my co-authors Adeline Heitz, Diziain, and Heleen Buldeo on urban logistics in times of COVID. It's a case study for France. And we based it on comprehensive surveys we did during the start of the first lockdown and the rest of the all year 2020, basically. Just a quick word on the demand for goods in cities in France all over last year. So there was a strict lockdown from same as my other co-speakers, March, May, basically. But then we had alternations of curfews, partial lockdowns, several other measures, etc. And overall, basically it's plus 32% of B2C products sold in 2020. So a growth rate that is twice as high as usual, let's say. And traditional retail has accelerated omnichannel, huge increase in grocery and do-it-yourself click and collect. And another big impact was that logistics became very visible to people and the media. So that's really a change for us, I would say. So I'm going to present to you some results of our surveys, and we focused on freight operators, so the service providers. We implemented 3 surveys during and after the first lockdown, and we wanted to get first-hand knowledge on urban logistics operations and challenges. And also we wanted to have a better knowledge on the specific operators' responses and solutions to the challenges. So one survey is the barometer of urban logistics in times of lockdown. We had a panel of 11 delivery companies from small to big. They answered every day, or let's say a few times a week, but the survey was a daily survey. And there was a weekly survey from the main freight business organizations as an addition. We did a survey number 2, which is interviews with stakeholders during the period March, April. So 17 with third-party logistics providers and shippers, and many interviews too with local public authorities. And the third survey was on another side of logistics service provision. It was on the development side, warehousing side. So we had a monthly survey on logistics real estate developers in France. And this was longer in time. It was a monthly survey, but it was from March to October. And we did that with Affilog, which is a trade organization for logistics developers, investors, managers, but also all the services around warehousing. So we had the main logistics real estate developers that did participate in a survey every month. Just one quick word about doing surveys during the pandemic. I thought it was actually quite a nice time for us, for academics, because many respondents seem to be very happy to testify on their activity during these very unusual times. And we did have a very good response rate for even our daily survey on the panel. And also, as you all know, we benefited from an abundance of webinars with the business community, with the cities, and that increased our access to information and actually to data. So that's also something I want to point out in terms of these new times, access to info and data. So a few of the results, of course, as the discussion already mentioned just before, delivery, sorry, my voice is a little bit shaky. So delivery urban operators met with an extreme variability of demand and big sectorial economic difficulties in some sectors, of course. And I just want to show you this table of weekly summaries of the surveys on operators. You can see a lot of red and a lot of green and a lot of gray. The gray is the situation was the same as before. The red was the situation was much worse because we didn't have so many deliveries to make. and the green was the situation was much better. We had so many more deliveries to make. I just, of course, not going into the detail, but I just want to show you how different it was from one week to another. So that's the extreme variability I'm talking about. And they had to face that, and they had to respond to that daily changes in orders and impossibility to predict orders even from one day to another. So freight companies involved in markets not associated with essential goods had to reorganize their activities, find new markets, accelerate basically shift to B2C, of course. So major shifts in destinations and types of goods. Increase in empty returns, deteriorating productivity was a key point that many mentioned. And overall, there was a higher productivity from better traffic conditions, of course, especially during the lockdown, the first lockdown. But it was counterplayed by less return freight, which is a major key point that operators mentioned. Staff disorganization, of course. More home deliveries as opposed to deliveries in pickup points, right? So diverging patterns for productivity for the freight operators. Partnerships formed between instant delivery platforms and major grocery retail chains. So Deliveroo and Casino got together, Uber Eats and Carrefour also. And this has remained as of today, of course. Another big new initiative was municipal web pages and apps, allowing local farmers to sell their products online and find delivery providers, and matching local stores, opening a delivery service to logistics startup companies. So a sort of big initiative from the cities themselves to match supply and new demand to provide goods to people in cities. In terms of the logistics real estate sector, they did well despite, of course, obvious obstacles, but logistics real estate was in a very good shape before the first lockdown. That's not the case for many transport companies, especially last mile transport companies, which suffered more the economic basic blow of COVID. But for logistics real estate, the pandemic generated major but short-term losses. And activities actually recovered. Overall activity only decreased by 7% in 2020, compared with the year before, which was already an exceptionally good year. So you see here the evolution of warehousing activity, both for developing new warehouses or managing warehouses. So that's the estimation by the AFILOG members during March, October. So you see lots of green and gray, which means business as usual or even better, right? So very specific sector, I think, warehousing, logistics, real estate. Three main issues for them: staff reorganization and sanitary restrictions, obviously. And there was even a court ruling in April about the Amazon's inability to comply with health regulations. And they had to close all their French warehouses for a few weeks. Don't worry, they still supplied cities and all the French clients from German, Italian, and the UK and warehouses abroad. So administrative delays in permitting was the main problem for developers at some point, especially April to September. Building licenses, impact studies, assessments, authorizations was very, very, very much delayed. And that became the #1 complaint. And of course, also relationships with clients, users, suppliers, and administrations were delayed. But really the administrative delays in permitting was a major key point that they mentioned as a problem. So we could also identify all the mood changes from this sector, the developers, the warehousing managers. And so there are keywords here. They had to adapt. They had problems with administrative bottlenecks, but very quickly, strong recovery, still administrative delays, And then they started to think about 2020 and how it will look. And then 2020 should be rather good. That was the assessment in September. And in October, it still should be very good, actually. There are concerns for 2021 due to missed opportunities, but something new came up in October. It's the fear of losing their image towards the general public and the media in terms of the sort of anti-Amazon feeling that was growing in the country and is actually still something that is existing today in France in terms of especially environmental impacts, social impacts of the all Amazon way of doing retail now. So we put together all our findings and we drew this summary table looking at capacity to adapt and level of disruption caused by COVID. And we looked at all the different segments of freight, logistics, service provision in France. And we categorized operators by their capacity to adapt and the level of disruption they had to face. So for example, we estimated that administrations delivering a building permit were in low capacity to adapt, whereas delivery operators in B2C groceries had a lot of disruption to do, much more volume and new clients, but they were very good in adapting to the new demand. In terms of the policy response, and that will be the conclusive slides of my presentation, there was very interesting trends. Quick responses to urgency. During the first lockdown, they were very good. So the short-term answer was, let's facilitate logistics. Delivery time windows were relaxed. Municipalities' websites, identifying local stores, proposing a home delivery service, as I mentioned before. That's the Paris website, matching delivery service and local boutiques. And it's identifying about 1,000 local retailers. So very good short-term response, I would say. And then policy response during the whole year after the lockdown was a little bit less easy on logistics and less conscious about logistics needs. So logistics was omitted from several post-lockdown initiatives. There was a lot of talk about the different urban world post-COVID, and especially reorganizing street space, tactical urbanism in terms of changing quickly, cheaply, and temporarily the use of space in cities. Of course, the corona lanes for bicycles, everything happened, but logistics was a little bit forgotten in many of these schemes. And one big example is that photo I just took actually down my apartment, but it's all over many French cities and especially Paris. So you have a delivery area here that has been occupied by restaurants and bars when they could open just after the first lockdown because they were granted an extension of their space, right, to offer more social distancing. But then restaurants and bars had to close again, and they never took their equipment out of the loading bays, which remained literally like that for the whole winter. So the loading bays were actually not accessible for the logistics, for the freight vehicle drivers because of the extension of terraces. But even when they were closed, these equipment remained. So a failure also to accommodate for logistics facilities development, building permits, as I mentioned. So now there's big discussions about changing urban logistics in a post-pandemic world. And as we were starting to have the discussion before, I think this whole very strange year of 2020 and also the first semester of 2021, it is indeed accelerating the use of some technologies. It is easier to get authorizations for testing automated delivery vehicles. but the operators or the promoters of these robots and drones are not asking for these authorizations. So they got easier to get, but they are not being asked. So that's a sort of paradox. It did accelerate new enforcement tools, such as plate reading cameras to enforce low emission zones. That's a very big acceleration in France. And that's partly because of the pandemic. But French cities could not use these cameras before, and now they will be able to. And also it did start the discussion in France for new methods for urban freight data and data sharing with freight operators. So there's new opening of the discussion on urban freight data. That's a good thing. Another discussion on improving the situation of gig workers for on-demand instant delivery platforms. Uber Eats and Deliveroo workers now have received much more attention, and their legal status is changing in France. And you saw what happened in the UK a few days ago also. So many things are changing because they became much more visible. And the third thing I wanted to point out was for France, an accelerated implementation of low and zero emission zones. But there is one remaining big discussion today, and it's even a dispute, I would say, between the local decision makers and the freight operators, is the status of trucks, so heavy goods vehicles, in the upcoming new traffic restrictions. Vans, all electric, no problem. But trucks will be a discussion for the next years when zero emission zones will be introduced in French cities. So thank you very much.